week's video edition of my reflections on current Web 2.0 technologies and some of the other emerging technologies that we see around us in our daily life. Today we're actually going to talk about something a little bit different. The topic of discussion for the week has been the continued expansion of blended and fully online learning. And I think that it's so fascinating, all of the different things that are occurring in particular in blended learning, kind of trying to take the best of both worlds in these fully online as well as face-to-face classes, because I definitely think that there are some advantages. You need to have some of that face-to-face interaction when it's possible, and certainly it's not always available. But for this week, while we just have a few minutes here to talk about this, on this video reflection, I actually want to talk about one of the other things that's not totally related to the fully online learning or the blended learning, and that was one of the articles that talked about kind of some of the new economies or some of the new business models around this idea of free. There's a great article on the Wired magazine called Free, Why Zero is the Future of Business, and it's by Chris Anderson, who is the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, and he's also the author of a book called Free, where he really explains a lot of this, and certainly a lot of this does relate to open source software, and and we can see kind of some of the benefits that come in from you make open source software, and then how you can develop it and use it in an educational source. But I want to talk about this article because I thought it was pretty interesting. He starts off first of all talking about the idea of you give away a product or service and you kind of shift the cost of that onto a different product. For example, you give away the cell phone, but you sell the monthly plan and require customers to have a 2-year contract. I have a previous background in telecommunications, and I worked for a phone company that sold cell phones, and I think in a lot of ways we've kind of created this interesting environment where customers, they expect cell phones themselves, the actual phones, to be very cheap or free. But when in reality, they're still very expensive devices, but they offset that by requiring you to get a 2-year contract. And this causes problems when something happens, their phone breaks, and they haven't fulfilled their contract. Customers many times don't understand that idea of why the phone was free in the first place. Another example, making the video game console relatively inexpensive and selling the games for a lot more money. Even it's interesting to note this point of his book that Chris Anderson has written. It's called Free. Is it free to buy? No, it costs about $20 to buy on Amazon. But some of this scaling does apply, because if you buy it on Amazon and if you have a Kindle, they only charge you $10 for the book because they want you to buy the Kindle, where they make back quite a bit of that money. They make up some of that profit. Anderson continues here. He says, over the past decade, however, a different sort of free has emerged. The new model is based not on cross-subsidies or the shifting of costs from one product to another, but on the fact that the cost of the products themselves is falling fast. And he talks in particular a lot about storage space or the processing power of computers, how that many companies can offer free storage space for services in exchange for something else. And Google is kind of the prime example of this, where pretty much all of the services that they offer are free to customers, but they make their money. In reality, Google is one of the largest marketing and advertising companies in the world. They sell ads, and that's how they recoup these costs. But the reason why they can do this is because the cost of storage space has dropped so much and the processing speed of computers has fallen so much that it allows them to give those services away for free. In this article, Anderson mentions a couple other interesting things too. He gives a couple examples, or a couple points here. He says, 40 years ago, the principal nutrition problem in America was hunger. Now it's obesity, for which we have the Green Revolution to thank. 40 years ago, charity was dominated by clothing drives for the poor. Now you get a t-shirt for less than the price of a cup of coffee, thanks to China and global sourcing. So too for toys, gadgets, and commodities of every sort. And I think that that's a really interesting point, that we create these demand, or these we have these problems for obesity, but we can really overcompensate. We had these problems of hunger 40 years ago, but then we can overcompensate so much that now we have this problem of obesity. And so you have this balance that companies are, and this can certainly apply to education as well, have to find that balance of, What can we give away for free, and what do we need to charge for? And let me spend kind of just the final couple minutes here talking about that. One of the things that I thought was interesting is he talks about this difference between cheap and free. And I think that this is very, it's a big deal with education too. If you don't want an inexpensive education, you don't want to go somewhere where you just have to pay a little bit necessarily, because then you might worry about the quality or something like that. But if you have one that's totally free, then you can think about the benefits that you get from that. And Anderson states it like this, says, from the consumer's perspective, though, there is a huge difference between cheap and free. Give a product away and it can go viral. Charge a single cent for it and you're an entirely different business, one of clawing and scratching for every customer. The psychology of free is powerful indeed, as any marketer will tell you. The huge psychological gap between almost zero and zero is why micropayments failed. And I think that's just a really interesting idea, that that there's some psychology involved in that. That we don't want to have to pay a penny for something, even though the difference between a penny and free is minimal at best. But the idea that psychological aspect of it, of giving something away, giving an open source software away versus charging someone a very cheap amount for it, and I think that's really interesting. The last point that I want to talk about here, the last quote that I want to read here, is he talks about the vaporization of value with some of these things. He says, traditionalists wring their hands about the vaporization of value and demonetization of entire industries. The success of Craigslist's free listings, for instance, has hurt the newspaper classified ad business. But that lost newspaper revenue is certainly not ending up in the Craigslist coffers. In 2006, the site earned an estimated $40 million from the few things it charges for. That's about 12% of the $326 million by which classified ad revenue declined that year. And I think that that's an interesting point, because certainly it's not just an exchange of where this money is going, from where people used to spend money on classified ads in newspapers, now they're spending it on Craigslist. No, that's not the case. But and I have no idea how you could really track this, because you see all that money that isn't being spent on those ads, and we can look at elsewhere. Where else might it be being saved, or where else it might be being spent? And so it's not just a transfer of money from one spot to another. It's a whole new way of thinking. It's a whole new business model. So, and I've heard many people talk about how Craigslist really single-handedly has caused the demise of many newspaper businesses, because that was such a key part of their business, was their revenue from advertising. And when they lost that revenue, when people started using Craigslist more, entire businesses have gone out of, or entire newspapers have gone out of business. So anyway, I think it's just really interesting to think about this notion of free and open source as it relates to education. I think it'll be interesting to see what lessons can we learn from this business model of free versus inexpensive or cheap, or even the lessons of charging less for one thing and transferring that cost over to something else, because I think that there's some of those models probably in education too. Anyway, I'll go ahead and close now, because there's a lot to think about, and I certainly don't have all of the answers, but hopefully you've enjoyed this discussion talking about this idea of free. I certainly am an advocate. I think there's a lot of benefits to having free and open software, free education, and anyway, I just think that there's a lot of interesting ideas within this business context, and hopefully some of it can be applied over into the educational settings in the future. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.